welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, where it snowed yesterday. And I have to say that I'm taking this as nature's way of telling us to all stay inside. So I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe as we continue to confront the COVID-19 situation. And one of the things that you can do in this time where we have more time inside is perhaps some people are engaging in more reading. I know I am, and I'm very much enjoying it. And I spent this morning reading a new graphic work entitled Enemy Alien, A True Story of Life Behind Barbed Wire, which is a graphic representation of a first-person memoir from the First World War. Very excited to welcome the author of Enemy Alien, Kassandra Luciuk, a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Kassandra, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
How did I do on the last name?
Perfect.
All
you
right,
nailed it.
That's great. Always my biggest concern when people come on is making sure I get names right. So let's talk about Enemy Alien. And as I said, this is a graphic work. Is it fair to call it a graphic novel because it's based off of a memoir? Does novel work here?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely works. It's we kept as close as we possibly could to the original source, which was a memoir that I found in the archives. But we had to do a little bit of editorializing. So I think graphic novel, graphic history, either of that works perfectly. Yeah.
Okay, so the book, as you said, it's this memoir that you found, and I'm curious though, why did you want to do a graphic novel, graphic representation of a first-person memoir? Because my initial thought would have been, you find this memoir, it tells this incredible story. Why not publish the memoir or work it into a way that those words that you found in that memoir are represented textually to reflect that original source you found? Like what is that process like? You find the source and then graphic novel. Just walk me through that process.
Yeah. So when I first came up with the idea for the book, I was actually working on an academic article on internment. So I never had any intention of straying from that academic format of publishing. And my mindset was very much so that I was going to turn this into something a little bit more formal, whether it was a book or an article. That was 100% the direction that I was going in. But the more that I sat on it, I realized how much of a good story this was from start to finish. And I didn't really know if I could do anything with it in the way that I wanted to in the confines of academic publishing. I had sort of, for the article that I was working on, I had pulled out as much as I could. But of course, there's only so many quotes and anecdotes you can add to any given piece. And I think a lot of historians actually have sources like this that either get diluted or simply never see the light of day because there aren't many spaces for them, or because we feel discouraged or are on our own self-conscious about doing work that others might not consider academically rigorous. Although, side note, I think we're getting better at finding the space for telling good long form stories, right? Things like Active History is a perfect example of this. And this is all now finding its way into the profession at the same time that it's also permeating the quote unquote outside world. But yeah, I just really wanted the story in its entirety to be told. And I just couldn't think of a way to do that in a traditional article or book. And two, I really wanted to highlight the voice of an internee. In a lot of ways, this is a historiography that relies heavily on others to kind of do the talking, because the source base was largely destroyed by the government in the 1950s, and the survivors have all now passed away. And even when they were alive, they were really hesitant to talk about it. There's this famous quote from an RCMP informant who says that Ukrainians remained in fear of the barbed wire fence. And this was well into the 1940s and 1950s. So for me, this was a way to ensure that the voice of an internee was unfiltered and uninterrupted and not really couched by my own commentary or ideas. And I think the last reason for this format is because I really wanted to write something on internment that could be accessed by a broader community in a way that's just a little bit more equitable. I wanted to get it into the hands of people who, for a variety of extremely valid reasons, aren't necessarily interested in picking up, a 400-page book, but who want to understand what happened here. They want to get to the core of the story in a frankly an easier way. So I think, to summarize, it's kind of part that the medium is conducive to a long form story, part that it allows an emphasis on the subject, and part that it really was a way to kind of branch out.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I think is really valid, as you say, the idea that we need to do a better job of making things engaging with people, that they can get into the story of what happened in the past. But you said something that I think is really interesting there, that you wanted the story told in a way that wasn't really couched in your ideas. But I'm curious that how do the images then reflect that? And not the specific images, but as you're coming up with the idea, would the images which are being created not inherently have some contemporary ideas and sensibilities within them, regardless of, and we'll talk about the partnership with the illustrator in a bit, but just as just a concept, do the images not inherently project some of that onto the text?
Yeah, I think to some extent that's something that's unavoidable, right? But what we did was we have a few, we're lucky enough to have access to a few photo albums from the camp. And so Nicole relied really heavily on those photographs to build the world of Enemy Alien. So we tried to stick as close as we could to what we knew was actually there. But again, right, I think to some extent this is unavoidable that our own ideas kind of creep into this. But I think what was more important for me was more so that the words reflected what the internee said. The images, I don't think it was as pressing, but I really wanted the words to be as close to what the author, whoever the author is, I wanted it to be them in their own words. I didn't want to do the kinds of editorial interventions to sort of like explain what things meant, or to sort of try to take away certain phrases or language he used to sort of soften it. I didn't want to do any of that, right?
Right, and we'll say too that this memoir that you found, it is of a Ukrainian Canadian who was interned in Kapuskasing during the First World War in a work camp, basically. And what's really curious to me, so I've done a little bit of work, not much, on the Ukrainian Canadian experience in the early part of the 20th century. I had a project recently on it at a site out in Manitoba, and what's interesting to me is that there's just this lack of resources. When I was trying to find information about this site, it was really difficult. So your work that you do normally is on the Ukrainian Canadian experience. So you find this memoir of this individual who is in this work camp, and what is your reaction to it when you find it? Just as a historian going through archives, I remember finding documents and almost wanting to get up and scream. I was so excited when I found something. But yeah. What was your response to finding this memoir that eventually is the source material for the book?
Yeah. So me too, by the way. I've done that quite a few times, or like placed very excited phone calls to like friends and family being like, oh my gosh, I found this. But, so I understand. But I think maybe to answer that, I can talk a little bit about the historiography too. So, like I briefly mentioned, the topic of internment as we know it today is actually still a really embryonic and nascent field. It hasn't really yet benefited from generations of academics making critical interventions. So we're still, well, we're at the tail end of what I like to call a first wave of scholarship. And the folks who did that work starting in the 1970s, 1980s, did a really good job, first of all, discovering that this even happened, right? We didn't know that internment happened. It's not like the government was shouting it from the rooftops. And then they also used really fragmentary evidence, to kind of piece this whole story together. And then from that, they were able to give us what, the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why of internment. And in a lot of ways, that's been really hard to beat for subsequent generations of academics because, we don't, once that's been done, because we don't have a very good source base for this, and we couldn't really rely on oral history, right? The majority of documents were destroyed by the government. So there wasn't really much to actually add to this. And the topic kind of sat. So what I tried to do when I got really interested in internment was I wanted to think a little bit outside of the box in terms of where to look, right? So the government records are gone, and others have already mined the kind of government adjacent records. But what about actually going into the community? That was the question that I asked myself, right? Just by the nature of what the internment operations were, we know that it disproportionately affected working class Ukrainians, some but not all of whom were also members of the organized political left. So first the Ukrainian Social Democratic Party and then the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association. So for anyone who's doing anything on kind of late 19th, 20th century Ukrainian Canadian history, it is absolutely mission critical to talk to Larissa Stavroff, whose archival collection as well as knowledge on the Ukrainian left is unparalleled. And so I was working with Larissa on my dissertation work. And one day I just kind of asked her if she happened to have anything on, the USDP/the ULFTA in relation to internment. And she was like, yeah, I do. And came out with this giant box of material. And so the memoir was in there. And, the rest, as they say, is history. But it really took a kind of, again, thinking outside the box about where to look. And then once I actually found it, there was also all sorts of material in there, all of which made its way into an academic article. But with this source, it was like that immediate feeling, that kind of like just almost out of body excitement of like, oh, there's something here. There's something I can do with this. So, it was a really good find.
So then once you have that and, you have this idea, this inspiration for the book, how does it come together? You have the illustrator, Nicole Marie Burton. How do you find her? How do you take it to the book is published by our friends at Between the Lines? And how do you find them? Like what is the collaborative nature of a book like this? Because a lot of historians, I think we're used to, traditional projects. You go, you do the research, you write it, you send it off, you get the comments back, reviewer two's a jerk, and so on and so forth. But this one is really a lot more of a collaborative project, in part, if not mostly, because of the images. So how do you find Nicole? How do you get to BTL? What is that process like?
Yeah. Right off the bat, I'll say that this whole project took 5 years, which is actually really upsetting to say out loud. I don't say that to discourage anyone, but it was really a long and a complicated road. And now granted, part of that is because I was a novice, right? I didn't really know much about the medium, and for that, I have to give a big shout out to the Graphic History Collective, because they were super, super helpful, and they gave me such great advice over the years. They were the first people I spoke to after I realized that I wanted to do this. So they were really, really helpful. And obviously I also had other projects on the go, the most important of which is my dissertation, my long suffering dissertation. So it wasn't full steam ahead all 5 years, but, so I'll try to break it down, how this all looked. So, the first thing I did, of course, was I had to translate it. The document was originally in Ukrainian. I had to then figure out how to frame it. Basically I was asking myself, are there enough pieces here for a story? Because it's not enough to just have someone lay out their experiences. You have to have story arcs. You have to have, lessons and significance. It has to make sense. So I was trying to figure out the framing. Once I realized that there was enough here, then I had to develop a script. So I put a script together, and then I moved on to the mission critical work of funding, because obviously the artist needs to get paid. And maybe actually we can talk a little bit later about, how difficult raising funding is for, especially graduate students and the precariously employed, because that was quite a ride. But once I figured out funding, then I started looking for the artist. And this was, I think, the single greatest delay. This actually took 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I spoke to a lot of artists trying to find a fit. Most of the people that I spoke to were very booked and very busy. And then there were others that just were clearly not a fit. And that was really discouraging, but I think I actually learned a lot from that. And, the first thing, and I'm being a little bit glib here, is just how erroneous that kind of middle class parental talking point of don't get an art degree, you'll never get a job is. So many artists told me that they were booking at least 2 to 3 years out, which is great for artists, but is not so great for me. And secondly, the lesson that I took from that is that you don't actually just want to find somebody who can draw, right? And in a lot of ways, that's the easy part. You kind of also need someone who gets it. And I think I really found that person in Nicole. So like you mentioned, Nicole Burden of Ad Astra Comics. So she kind of made, the 3 years of searching worth it, I'd say, because she really instantly understood the project. I remember the first time that we met, I just really felt like this was safe with her, right? I think this is hard to admit, but if I'm going to be honest, and in a lot of ways, I really felt like this was kind of like my thing, right? It was kind of my thing to tell, right? I discovered it. It was about my community. It was about, the experience of my community, but I just felt, very comfortable with her, and I knew that she would do it justice. And I think anyone who reads the book will very clearly see that. But meeting her was kind of one of those moments that reminds you that sometimes you can't rush. Sometimes you just have to let fate intervene, which I did. And I think it worked out great. But yeah, once she signed on, then things started moving quickly, right? It was, 3 years to find her, and then everything else was sort of fast. So we built a storyboard together, which I learned is quite a bit different than a script. It actually involves talking through and visualizing how every single panel is going to look. And that's different than just simply putting the words on paper. Then we created some sample pages. And then we wrote up our application for Between the Lines. Once it was accepted by them, it was kind of just off to the races to sort of get it done. In terms of the collaborative process with Nicole, Nicole kind of has an unmatched intuition in her drawing. You had mentioned before about like our own sort of like present day creeping in, but it was really weird how without even much direction at first, Nicole just kind of like put things on paper and it worked really well. But yeah, Nicole's also a very careful researcher. Like she she would come over and she would borrow every book on internment off my bookshelf. She poured through the photo albums I shared with her. She asked tons of questions. So because of all that, I just sort of felt really good about letting her do her own thing. My job was kind of the words, but I wanted her to interpret them in her own way. That being said, we did collaborate on a few things. We walked through the storyboard. That was quite a bit of work, and we went over that many, many times to make sure that things were just right. And we also did several rounds of edits on the finished product. So just tons of back and forth, moving things, like moving text, like eliminating mistakes, cleaning up the background, things like that. We did tons of work on that. And overall, I think it was a really positive process. Certainly for me as a historian who, like you mentioned, is kind of used to doing a lot of solitary work. But it was also really cool to see someone then articulate words, that I wrote, right, in a different medium. It's kind of a cool thing to see and a really good exercise in improving my writing, because now, right, I'm writing my dissertation and now I'm always thinking, how would someone draw what I'm explaining right now? So it's been good for helping me clean up a little bit.
And how much, though, is the book reflective of Nicole's perspective? And I guess what I mean in that is, you're the expert in the field, and, it's great that she was doing research and learning more about the topic, but ultimately someone has to have a final say in it, right? Was there a point at which, or at any point where you're like, no, this doesn't really reflect what this is about, or was there that much trust that she was going to get it right?
There was that much trust that she would get it right, and the first time that I saw the first draft, it was right. We had some back and forth about some really, specific things, right? We did a lot of work making sure that, for example, the military uniforms were as accurate as we could possibly make them, right? And, we poured through the photographs to make sure that, the poofs in the sleeve or the cusps the cuffs were as accurate as we could possibly make them. We had a very long debate about the bayonets. We spent an obscene amount of time looking up male underwear in the 1910s to make sure that we drew those accurately. So there were things like that we definitely spent time editing, and that needed work. But the wholesale project, the first time I saw it, it was there, right? Like as an expert on the topic, I just went, wow, she got it, right? And again, part of that is intuition. But part of that is also that, she was really careful. Like we spent a lot of time with a particular set of maps of the camp, because she wanted to make sure that the background always made sense. It wasn't supposed to be like, she wanted you to be able to tell where you were in the camp, right? So all of that, she did without much intervention on my part. I think she's the star here. She did a really great job.
So one of the things that I want to talk about too is the existence of these camps. A lot of people are going to be familiar with internment camps during the Second World War, and the history community has talked about that a lot in recent years, but a little less about the First World War. So I'm curious, when were these camps opened, and what was the process through which individuals were sent to the camps?
The camps first opened in 1914, not too long after Canada officially goes to war. And basically the way that you earned your ticket to the camp, so to speak, was if you carried a passport from a nation who Canada was at war with, right? So in the case of Ukrainians, most Ukrainian immigrants to Canada at this point carried Austro-Hungarian passports. So this was the official reasoning why they were considered enemy aliens and why they could be interned. Now, not all were interned. Just over 8,500 people end up interned during the First World War. About 5,000 to 6,000 of those were Ukrainian. About 80,000 others were forced to register with the government and report to local police, right? They had to constantly be checking in with local police to make sure that they hadn't left or sort of, they weren't up to no good. So that was kind of the official reasoning, but the actual specific reasons why people were picked up varied greatly. So, for example, John Boychuk, the protagonist of Enemy Alien, is simply walking down the street, minding his own business, and he's stopped by the police who ask him where he's from. And he tells them that he's from Galicia, and they say, come with us. Others were arrested and interned for trying to cross the borders, most in search of work. We know that Ukrainian Canadians and others were the first to lose their jobs in patriotic dismissals, Germans as well. And so a lot of them were now destitute and without work and sort of not knowing what else to do. They tried to leave in the hopes that they could find greener pastures in the United States. Others were applying for relief to their local governments, and the governments would basically just pick them up, and it was kind of a form of weaponized relief. They'd throw them into the camps as a way to kind of rid their own roles. Some were, especially post 1917, some were arrested for subversive material, anti-war literature, but also for labor agitation, or sort of for being a member of, in the Ukrainian case I mentioned, the Ukrainian Social Democratic Party. If you were a leader of that party, that was a reason to get sent to a camp. So there were all sorts of reasons for why on the ground. You had to have the Austro-Hungarian passport, but then there was something else that sort of had to put the gaze of the government on you. And so we have the camps most open in 1914, and they're kind of sent, internees are sent in waves. Some start at one camp and end up at others. So there's a really interesting story of Fort Henry, which housed a camp for a few years. So it opened in 1914, and the internees there were put to work right away on repairing the fort. And the guards loved this, and the military loved this because they had this free labor to basically take this disheveled fort and turn it into something sort of like serious again. And then the military thought, well, maybe we could put these internees to work outside of the confines of the camp. Maybe we could get them, building bridges, building roads, clearing land in and around Kingston. And local labor unions actually freak out at this and threaten to go on a general strike if they put the internees to work outside of the camp. So instead of just backing off, the military actually says, well, there's no use for them here. Let's send them off to another camp. So Fort Henry closes, and internees get sent to Petawawa or to Kapuskasing. So these things are kind of also directly tied to the kinds of labor they could exploit from the internees, and the kinds of projects they could put them to use for. So in Kapuskasing, when Boychuk first arrives, there's sort of nothing there, right? Kapuskasing at that point is just called McPherson Station, right? But there's absolutely nothing there. Indigenous communities had already been dispossessed, but there's sort of no town, and there's not even an internment camp yet. So they actually put them to work building their own camp, which is really dark. But so in Kapuskasing, the internment operations were really meant to be a kind of foothold for colonial expansion and settlement, right? They were supposed to clear the land there. They were going to work in the government experimental farm to figure out what settlers could grow on the clay belt and how the government might profit off the land. They were going to build the railway. They were going to provide essential services like firefighting for the earliest settlers and so on. And again, we see this all around the country. I mentioned Fort Henry, but also Banff is another great example of this. The internees there did a lot of the same work, but they were also put to work on private projects like the golf course, right? So they're sort of doing all this work, and of course, no Canadians are going to actually do this. So the state gets to really capitalize on this captive population of non-white migrants by the standards of the early 20th century to do mission critical work in building the nation without the perks to getting to join it, right? So it's a kind of, in a lot of ways, it's a really quintessential Canadian story, which is something that I say in the introduction of the book, right? Internment wasn't a regretful anomaly. This was part of the regular functioning of nation building.
Yeah, and it really forces us to think, too, about even just a place like Kapuskasing. If you go there, just to think of it, its origins in this light kind of changes the way we can understand and think about a place like that in 2020. And our relationship with these places. It changes the more we learn about the origins of the state's presence there. It's not just a story of dispossession. It's a story of, the subsequent building up of that colonial state is done through arguably another form of dispossession of these people's rights. And it really is, when you think about it, kind of, obviously it's sad to think about the experiences, but it's also kind of terrifying to think that, we are in this country, we talk a lot about, you fly the flag and patriotism and all that, but you hear these stories, and the fact that these are the stories that tend to be forgotten is troubling when you think of larger national narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And it's, it's a hard thing and a complicated thing to grapple with, but, it's the connection between the internment operations and the Canadian state as we know it are clear when you start really looking into it. Right.
So you mentioned that a lot of the records from this aren't always available, that you came across this memoir kind of by luck and by looking outside of the box. So a question that I would have as a result is, how do we know that this is accurate? The problems with memory certainly are clear. There can be issues associated with that, but also a person who's writing this first person memoir at the time would presumably, and probably rightfully, have a bit of a vendetta or be upset about what's going on. So how can we fact check the accuracy of what is being written about in the book against what other available sources are there?
Yeah. So this is a really good question. And this was something that I really grappled with, especially when I first found it, because I was reading it and, of course, there are things that check out that you just know if you know the story of internment, but there were other things that I said like, oh, really? Did that happen? Or, I said, oh, I didn't know about that. So, that was something that I was really, really, concerned with. So, for me, what I did was I ended up spending a lot of time in the archives and a lot of time consulting with other folks who do internment work to make sure that I got as much as I possibly could right. And it was really funny, actually. Sometimes I wasn't even thinking about this project, and I'd stumble upon things in the archive that independently corroborated things, right? So, and that was really neat, actually, because it really made me feel confident in the legitimacy of the memoir. So we left a few little historical Easter eggs that kind of add a kind of historical complexity to this book. But these were, for example, and this was something that I was able to independently corroborate with another source, and so I added it in. So the book talks about an escape tunnel that's dug by the internees. It starts in the second class barracks. It makes its way into the first class barracks, and then they were going to sort of tunnel out. And in another archive, I also heard this story about this escape tunnel, and it was the same thing, right? It starts here, it ends here. This was their plan. And the guard, it was in the archival collection of the guard who actually found the tunnel, and his name was Watson Kirkconnell. So for historians of Cold War Canada in particular, Watson Kirkconnell is a really big name, right? He's Canada's leading anti-communist academic, and he's a prolific Cold Warrior. So he's like a really famous guy, and that's why I was in his archive to begin with for my dissertation work. But I was reading through his internment records, and I learned that he, at the time of the internment operations, he was actually working as a quartermaster for the Canadian Army, and he was stationed first at Fort Henry and then at Kapuskasing. So Nicole actually drew him into the book. So she used a picture of him, and so when you see the guard actually opening it up, that's the actual person who found the tunnel, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I mean, I won't give the rest of the Easter eggs away because I want people to find them on their own. But, we made very deliberate decisions about things in the book that might not really be obvious at first glance to have any significance behind them, but that were really, really important to us. And I think, ultimately, in terms of just like accuracy and fact checking, like there's always room for improvement, as with any work. But we really took the time to make sure that we got sort of everything that we could right. And when we didn't know something, specifically when I didn't know something, I was as clear as I possibly could be, right? Like the biggest outstanding one being who actually wrote this memoir. And I sort of own up to that right away, because I think that, there are things that remain completely unknown to me that I want to be honest about. But we also, I think, weren't going to, I mentioned this earlier about, things like, uniform cuffs or hats. Like if I'll be honest, we weren't going to lose sleep over any of that kind of minutia if those criticisms ever came our way, because to us, that didn't really make or break the story. We were really set on just making sure we could fact check like the bigger picture, like that all the stories that Boychuk told were true, that, the names of people he mentioned, were the names of the actual people, that the dates lined up, like I went and found Boychuk's, because there were actually Boychuk's in the camp. We don't think that it was him, but I went and used the date he claimed that a bunch of them were paroled on, and I found that in fact, yes, a group of internees were released on that day into into custody of DOSCO, the Dominion and Coal Steel Company. But so we did as much of that as we could to make sure that, the bigger picture was right. But also we left a few kind of minor imprecisions in the work because of their creative potential. So I think a really good example of this is at the beginning of the graphic novel, the protagonist is being arrested. And behind him, you can see the infamous, "They are fighting, why aren't you?" propaganda poster. And, that poster wouldn't have been there as early as December 1914. But for us, we were trying to kind of conjure an emblematic image and feeling, and to kind of make a subtle point, right? Like we wanted to really make that kind of like dichotomy clear. So we went with it, right? So.
But if part of it is starting from this, we don't know who wrote this. Like that's the part that I find the most interesting about it, right? That you find this memoir, you can't know for sure who wrote it. Does everything that springs off of that then not come into question? I don't think it compromises sort of the integrity of the project at all, but does it not leave some sort of doubt as to why this thing was put together, and answering that kind of bigger so what question of why does this exist? Personally, that would nag at me, right? Mm-hmm. Like if I was sort of doing this project, that would constantly nag at me. So I'm just curious as to how you confront that reality of not knowing 100% who wrote this thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, first of all, I think that's reflective of the kinds of ways that Ukrainians overall responded to internment, right? I mentioned, right, they lived in fear of the barbed wire fence, and many of them weren't willing to put their names on documents, right? For very valid reasons, right? And, for members of the organized left, which, whoever this author, was a member of the movement, we also have to consider that he's writing in 1945, so he just witnessed another wave of political repression through DOCR mandated crackdowns, right? There was, we saw internment during the Second World War of communists. In the 1930s, we saw repression, and we saw some Ukrainian leaders, arrested alongside Tim Buck with the sort of crackdown on the Communist Party. After the war, the Cold War takes off. So for somebody like this, who's sort of conscious of the way that the state engages with his community, keeping the name off of it, it doesn't trouble me because it just makes so much sense. And then, doing the kinds of work that I did in the archives, the Watson-Kirkconnell example is a great example, right? This is an archive that independently corroborated so many of these details that, if you had not been in the camp, you simply wouldn't know, right? Mm-hmm. So, once I started finding those things, I became more and more confident. But, you're right in the sense that, why was somebody influenced to write this? I think we can see the answer to that in the conclusion of the book when he he reflects, I think, rather profoundly about sort of what this story all means, right? So he talks about, what it means to be, a migrant in Canada who's coming up against a xenophobic society. He talks about what it means to be a worker who's kind of, as we talked about, like unwittingly engaged in advancing settler colonialism while also being forced, by a bayonet to fuel capitalist accumulation, what this meant for the community psyche, how this historical moment kind of stains the promises of liberal democracy in Canada while at the same time being really emblematic of it. And I think that's where, he's writing this in 1945. I think that's where we see his kind of present day biases and perspectives creep in, because he's trying to say, this is actually a much bigger story, like, internment, right? In a lot of ways, right? Like, again, isn't this anomaly? Look at this bigger picture way that the state treated us, right? So I think that gives us a clear sense of why he wrote it and why he wrote it in this way. And I feel, I don't feel worried about sharing that. I feel kind of okay about that. Right.
Sort of to bring it full circle then, given that, and I think that's a really good answer to the question, how do you think the author, whoever this is, would feel about it being told in this format, the story? Because I've never read a graphic novel before. I wasn't into comics as a kid. I love reading about what the Graphic History Collective does, but I'm not one who is really engaged in this format a lot because, and I realize this is unfair to the format, but it feels like something that's for kids. Mm-hmm. And again, I realize that is unfair to the format, but given that it has, I think, that reputation still mm-hmm. a little bit, how do you think that whoever wrote this would feel about the story being represented in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think that, that's fair. And I understand that people have that reaction. Absolutely. I get where it comes from. And, I had a lot of pushback in earlier days from people that I mentioned that I was doing this work to, who kind of felt like maybe it was a little bit, either distasteful, or that it wasn't serious, or that, it wouldn't convey what I would want it to convey. But I've been comforted by people's responses to it once they've seen the finished project. And I think, I don't say this to to brag or anything, but I feel like I've convinced some of the naysayers that this is actually a really profound and important format that we can tell these stories through. So I think that whoever this is, I would hope that they would see that this is a serious project, and it really tried to take seriously their story and to do justice to their story, and that the intent was to get them on a record because they had for so long not been able to be on the record. I mean, chances are that by the time historians started publicizing internment, this person had already passed away. So they had lived their whole lives not getting a chance to tell other people about this. And, I'm really struck, the book ends, with Luciuk going to a cemetery and he's going to visit the people who died who he was with in the camps, and he says, right, like, here the men who cleared forests lay forgotten by the world as if they were made by another god, but I had not forgotten them. As I walked back into town, I remembered what all of us internees promised each other in the camp. We were going to tell the world about how we were tortured, and it would become a part of history. And I think when I read that, first of all, I wept, I'll be honest, but second of all, I took that as a green light,
I think that's a very powerful line for sure. You mentioned in your response sort of this idea that some people around you did not take this project seriously, and you also mentioned earlier the issue of funding. And anyone who has gone through a graduate program understands and can sympathize with the struggle of trying to secure funding for anything, not only just how difficult it is, but the hoops that you have to jump through in order to get it. And what's interesting about this particular book compared to some of the academic books that I've looked at and seen is this has a broader range of, it seems to me, broader range of funders. So, who was your target for funding, and how difficult was it to secure that funding for a graphic history novel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I thank you for the graduate student solidarity comment there, but I think you're right. Everyone who goes through this knows what this can be like.
And it's not fun. I don't want to say that we just know what it's like. It sucks. It's a terrible process. I wouldn't wish it on anybody else. It's not fun. I never want to do it again because of how tedious and annoying it can be. And that even when you, or in my cases at least, when in the cases where I was successful with funding, it was more relief than joy.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of my little rant on the funding process. But
yeah, like, I've been involved in a few projects this year that all of us were graduate students, or we were newly graduated precarious faculty, and it really opened my eyes to the kinds of structural limitations on us if we want to get involved in the historical community. So, for example, I co-organized a conference on labor in the Canadian carceral state, which was unfortunately canceled because of COVID-19. But because none of us had permanent institutional affiliation, opening a bank account or finding a university to administer our funds for us was like really difficult. And that's just one example. But we ended up having to rely on this kind of patchwork network of like benevolent actors to help piece our funding system together. But even that, it was such an added stress, because instead of it being this kind of straightforward process of cut this check, deposit this money, balance the books, it became a literally national collaborative project of email chains and phone calls just to accomplish the simplest of things, right? Yeah. We all expect that conferences are going to be hard work, but we were worrying about all the things that are normally the simplest tasks. And, in the grand scheme of things, this is a really kind of small fish. when it comes to graduate student and precarious faculty complaints. But I think it's also emblematic of the kinds of roadblocks that we have when we do what we're told we should do, which is to partake in our community and add to the conversation, right? Like the system isn't really set up to facilitate our participation, which is, my kind of hot take for today. But in terms of like the book specifically, I had a really hard time convincing people that this was legitimate, right? And some of that was that people rightfully didn't really understand the format, and I don't blame anyone for that, right? Like I get it. I think that's really that's fair, but some of it was a little bit more problematic, right? Like I had funding sources who basically didn't believe I was legitimate because of my lack of credentials, which is sort of a funny thing to say to somebody, who's a PhD ABD with several publications that prove I can pull this off, right? And publications on internment at that, right? Like I had a track record and the field expertise on the particular subject. And yet I was straight up told by several funding sources that as a graduate student, I just wasn't eligible, right? And I think the other problem that's maybe a bit more broadly applicable is that it wasn't all that hard to justify that the artist deserved to be paid, right? That was a budget line that made sense to everybody. But I couldn't get anyone to agree that my labor was worth something. So, the translation work, the tens, if not hundreds of hours in the archives, the script building, the fact checking, the reading and researching, the 5 years of administrative work, not a single source of funding agreed that this was worth anything. Right.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose you could argue that this is part of life. You're gaining experience. It's a labor of love. It's worth it in the end. Right. And like to some extent, again, that's fine. I suppose I don't disagree that it's a labor of love, because if I wasn't absolutely in love with this project, believe me, I would have stopped a long time ago. But I also, I don't want to shy away from pointing out that it's really problematic that the work we do as historians doesn't register for everyone as labor. That's really, really scary.
Yeah.
But I got lucky in the end, right? In a way that I think is kind of one of these more like it's a sort of more subtle privilege that my community was interested in doing commemorative work on internment, and I was able to tap into sources of funding that way. So I was able to find just enough to get the artist paid, and I said that was good enough. I'll eat it. I want to get this done. As long as I can pay the artist, let's go. So.
And I will say too, the whole labor of love thing. I've had people at various events and conferences and stuff, again, try to justify either underpaying or not paying graduate students because you should be doing this for love and for passion. I'm like, yeah, okay, I love it, sure, but the main cause of divorce is financial issues. So love doesn't overcome everything, and at the end of the day, you have to be able to have a roof over your head and feed yourself and all that. So yeah, the way in which labor is completely discounted, unless you're a full-time faculty member, is really shocking to me. Those people's labor seems to be understood and appreciated, but everyone below them doesn't seem to be. And it really is upsetting to see, and to see the people who have been kind of pushed out of the profession because of that. It's really troubling, and it's a trend that certainly needs to be addressed in some capacity. Now, let's not end on that. That doesn't seem like a fun way to end the show. So let's finish with this. Like, when people are out, they're looking for something to read, what is the pitch for the Enemy Alien for you? What if someone comes to you and says, here, I see this on the shelf. I'm at Chapters. I see this on the shelf. Well, I'm not at Chapters. I'm online, and it comes up as a recommended reading because we can't go to bookstores right now. Why should I read this book?
Yeah, I think, first of all, because I would argue, first of all, because I think it's a really fun book, and not in the sense of the content, but because of its format. It's accessible, but it tells you a true story. You learn about history, without doing the hard work of reading a history book, right? Which I think is like, I want to be very, practical about that. I think that's a huge draw. But I also think, to get a little bit more, philosophical, it really drives home a few really critical things that I hope can, inspire readers. I think the first thing is that, the book shows that in times of crisis, the Canadian state shows us time and time again that it's willing to scapegoat the most vulnerable members of society, right? And we need to be conscious of that, especially now, as the buzz around emergency powers is increasing again, right? Like it's, in a lot of ways, this has been a really hard time to release a book. My book launch was canceled because of COVID, but in a lot of ways, the parallels between this book and, not only things like the pandemic ravages the internment camps, but also the conversation that we're starting to have about, what do emergency powers look like? I think it's very timely in that sense. The second thing that I think the book teaches people, again, in this kind of subtle way that doesn't hit them over the head, is that, we really need to be clear that the victims of xenophobia and racism don't just live in this kind of like, it's not this isolated year or two of discrimination, right? They live their whole lives there in that space, and their experiences under the system of Anglo supremacy are total, right? And that's something that, I think readers can take away from this book, especially in that reflective section towards the end of the book, right? The third thing I think readers might sort of think about if they read this book is the ways that martial law is really implemented in practice, right? So, it's subtle. It doesn't transpire all at once. There's usually a lag between when the government gives itself power and when things like internment or conscription and broader political repression happen. And it's not always obvious that it's happening. So in all of this, I think creates this perfect illusion with the public that martial law doesn't really have any material consequences, because the kinds of tangible markers, that things have changed aren't necessarily there. And we can compare that and contrast that to other elements of war that are super obvious. So the point is that it's important to kind of really stay vigilant, because usually by the time that the consequences of martial law are explicit, it's already too late. And I think this book can teach us that it's important to, be clear-eyed about how martial law materializes and how it's used. And, perhaps most importantly, we have to remind ourselves that, on paper, state power is certainly absolute, but it can always be checked. And I think John Boychuk and his fellow internees, I think in a lot of ways did that in their own way.
And that's a great reason why people should buy the book. Absolutely. So we would encourage everybody to go get it. Check it out. It's Enemy Alien, a true story of life behind barbed wire, from our friends at Between the Lines Presses. And you can certainly get it online, right, Kassandra?
Yes, absolutely. On the website.
Yeah. So check out BTL. Is it BTLbooks.com?
I believe so. Yeah, BTLbooks.com. Yes.
Yeah. So definitely head there, check it out, and really, I really enjoyed it. As somebody who doesn't read graphic novels, had never read one before, really enjoyed it. As Kassandra said off the top, it's something you can go through pretty quick, but it's very engaging and really keeps you into it the whole time. So again, Kassandra, congratulations and good luck with the book. Really hope it does well, and certainly definitely worth people checking it out. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. As always, appreciate you joining us. Please do, if you have not yet, subscribe to the show wherever it is you get your podcasts. Do the likes and the ratings. Give us some comments. That just helps other people find the show, keeps the show going. And if you're enjoying the show, please do tell your friends to check out some of our past episodes. Recently, as part of our pandemic weekly episodes, we had our episode talking about Hamilton as public history. That was a lot of fun to have Tara Brookfield and Chris Tyndall on to talk about Hamilton. Talked about the documentary Finding Sally. That is available on CBC Gem now, the documentary. We could, if you want to go back, listen to the episode about that. We drafted all-time great fantasy hockey teams. So a lot of stuff out there to check out. So please do go back into the History Slam archive if you enjoyed this episode. Of course, we will be back next week as we continue our weekly episodes during COVID-19. And I will shout out to Aaron Boys. We finished yesterday our year in review 100 year later segment. We went back and did the years we missed in the 2000s from 1910, 11, and 12. And then yesterday we did our Winners at War recap, where we decided the biggest event of the 1910s. So head over to Active History, check that out, check out all the content out over at Active History. Got a lot of good stuff going on over there. So if you want to, you can always reach the show, historyslam@gmail.com. I'm available on Twitter at Dr. Shawnee Fever if you have ideas for suggestions of what you would like to see as we move forward. So we hope everyone is staying safe out there. We'll be back with you next week. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.